This podcast is dedicated to the memory of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Farron, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein, and to Michael Mageau and Brian Hartnell. This is Zodiac Speaking, a classic Gunpoint Family podcast. I'm your host, Chris Garcia. Welcome back to Zodiac Speaking. And of course we're back because people are saying Zodiac has been solved. And almost as interesting is that they're also claiming that the Black Dahlia has been solved. Again, no law enforcement is saying that. Former law enforcement is, including a couple of people who I think should know better. But I'm going to sort of approach this more as a Black Dahlia thing and then moving it over. The claim is that early suspect in the Dahlia case, a guy by the name of Marvin Margolis, is also the Zodiac killer. A lot of different reasons for that. Two that are very important is that, one, he had medical training. He had been in World War II, had served in Okinawa, which absolutely brutal battle. And there's, of course, this theory that I hate personally, that if you are in intense, brutal battles like that, and you have any sort of sociopathy or psychopathy, that it activates, it turns you into a killer, unable to remove yourself from the intense fight or die idea that you were placed in. Of course, that's way too simplistic, considering we had a generation of serial killers that definitely were not in the army. And, you know, there were some who were definitely in Vietnam. But you look at someone like Joseph D'Angelo, who wasn't. He was just a guy who happened to murder people brutally. Richard Ramirez, Ted Bundy. These weren't folks who saw combat. And they were the worst of the worst. Now, one of the reasons why Margolis came up initially was that after the war, he had served in the Navy as a medical corpsman and had gone for pre-med at USC. But he lived in a house with one guy and then Elizabeth Short and her friend Marguerite. Now, this is where things get a little bit dicey, I think. They were definitely friendly, and the apartment was at the Guardian Arms on Hollywood. And apparently they were only there for about 2 weeks. One of the reasons why also Margolis was considered a suspect was that he was reluctant to speak to the police. I would be too, frankly, if I knew they were trying to pin the Dahlia on me. Now, we do know that he went to Chicago. He came back and forth around, but I think there's actually a statement that was made by one of the district attorneys, Arthur Veach, and he actually asked Harry Hansen a question. And Harry Hansen is a figure who is really important in the whole Dahlia thing. Someday I may do a Dahlia podcast, because it's one I've been looking at over the years, and the view of it very much mirrors how Hollywood is viewed in general for that time period. But here's what we got here. I think it might be just as well to ask you a question which in itself would be directly leading, but you are aware, I presume, of the investigation with respect to the fact that within 60 days of her death, the girl roomed and stayed in the rooms of a medical student at USC, Marvin Margolis, who entered USC in September of 1946, and whose first obligation under his entry was to dissect a human corpse, and that Marvin Margolis is now in Chicago, and that a checkup is being made. And Hansen answered, "No, I am not. The name is very familiar." I think he was being misleading there. I think he knew that name very well. I think one of the interesting notes here that I think is really important is that Margolis was a part of that crew who, in Hollywood at that time, there were all sorts of folks. There were no real, like the whole surrealist angle towards a crime is, sometimes I say ridiculous, sometimes I say just coincidental. It's one of the two. Now, The Tide of the Zodiac comes from research done by a guy, which I think is ridiculous. Not that a guy did the research, but that he was using AI. And his name's Alex Baber. And he claimed he cracked the 13-symbol cipher with "My name is Marvin Merrill," which is a name that Margolis used later in life. Now, what's interesting is that he used AI to generate millions, apparently, of names, and then to filter it to ones that had meaning within a list of different things. So you might have historical records that look for known murderers, criminals, blah, blah, blah. There is significant circumstantial overlap. And, there's super strong overlap in the Dahlia. I would not dispute him being... If someone said to me, yeah, we have proof that Marvin Margolis is the Dahlia killer, I would say, I could buy that. If someone said, for example, we have evidence that Arthur Lee Allen is the Zodiac killer, I would say the same thing. Now, this is not the first time the connection between the two cases has been shown, or at least hinted at. The first notable one, of course, is Eddie Edwards. Now, Eddie Edwards is a terrible Dahlia capability. He would have been like 14. And he's an even worse Zodiac suspect just because of timing and locations. I don't think it's Eddie Edwards. But there is a note that I'm interested in. Now, everyone keeps pointing to the idea that the Zodiac came because of the Zodiac watch in the logo. But there's also a motel down south called the Zodiac that he had some... I don't know if it had attachment to it or it was in an area where he would have been around. Could be. Who knows? Zodiac is not a rare word. But there's an interesting note. So, supposedly, Margolis drew this sketch shortly before he died of a mutilated woman, and he wrote Elizabeth. And in the hair, hidden like a Hirschfeld image, was Zodiac. Now, I haven't seen that actual image. I don't know if it exists, honestly, anymore, or if it ever did on it. But more than one person has apparently pointed that out. What I would need to see to really consider him a better suspect for Zodiac is very simple. One, definitive ties to either Vallejo, Benicia, of course, any of those cities up there. Now, San Francisco, everyone has connection to San Francisco, honestly. But there's also an interesting note in that if he did kill the Dahlia, was that a one-off and then a long cooling period until he got to the Zodiac crimes? There aren't a lot of unsolved crimes with that level of mutilation that the Dahlia had in the U.S. There are some. But if he went that far in his first ones, why only shoot two kids in a car? That's really where it sort of falls apart for me, is the MOs are so different. And maybe it's that he realized he didn't like the slicing and dicing. He just preferred the actual act of the killing. It could be. I don't know. But it doesn't have... Like, if the 13-character cipher was beaten here and broken, does that suggest that it is Marvin Margolis? It hints towards it, for sure. There's also the possibility that the letters and the killings have nothing to do with each other. I have gone back and forth on this. I truly believe that the first two and the last two are by different killers, and that the second killer was emboldened by the first and used that and had knowledge of that, which would mean either a cop, a journalist, someone who had direct knowledge of the case. So he could answer those questions, type of ammo, what he actually did. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I'm hoping that we dig further into this on the Zodiac side. If the FBI and LAPD closes the case at this point, I'm fine with that, even if it means that we're saying it is Marvin Margolis. He also has a deep tie to Santa Barbara. And of course, we know about the disputed Zodiac killings that are in Santa Barbara. I don't know. But that deep gap between these two and the significant differences really make me more questioning. Which then brings me, of course, to the differences between the first two killings in the Zodiac cases and the last two. So I don't know. There are a whole bunch of possibilities here, and I think looking at them separately is a better idea. But I think looking at them together provides a better story, which, in the case of Zodiac, is always a plus. Thank you for listening to Zodiac Speaking. I'm Chris Garcia. Hopefully I will have another one sometime. I don't know. I'm definitely going to be wrapping up pretty soon, because I've covered pretty much everything I need to, I think. But I do want to look at the more recent, the rise of actual researchers, and look at a couple of researchers and their theories and how they sort of played out. And yeah, thanks for listening.